Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. With me is Ben Kinsley, my partner in crime, co-producer and co-host. And joining us is Jill Krowinski, who's the House Majority Leader for the Democrats. Jill, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
In February.
That's right.
And as we always ask our guests to tell a little bit about themselves, just to remind our viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I represent the Old North End in downtown Burlington. I was actually appointed to the legislature by Governor Shumlin in 2012 and then was elected in my own right and later on that year. Great. And this past session, I was elected House Majority Leader, which is a huge honor. Right. Before that, I spent all of my time on the House Human Services Committee, and that was a really good place for me because a lot of my background is around public health. I worked at Planned Parenthood of Northern New England for about 8 years in many different roles, but doing a lot of community outreach and education. And so that gave me a lot of experience and understanding what some of the challenges are in communities across Vermont. Right. And so now I'm at the legislature full time, and yeah, it's been quite a interesting session that we've had.
North End has just changed so much over the years. My daughter and her husband, when they first got married, they lived in the North End. Great houses and just a nice community of people. Did you take? Whose place did you take?
So it was Representative Rachel Weston who got an amazing job opportunity doing democracy building work, and I think Kyrgyzstan. I can't remember exactly where it was, but yeah, she's an incredible, smart woman, and we're trying to get her back to Vermont. So we'll see how we do.
Oh, that'd be cool. I enjoyed her company.
Big
she was
shoes
great.
to fill.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I remember we talked a little bit when you were here in January about the fact that the leadership team in the House now is basically all women, which is kind of a cool thing. I'm not sure that that's happened in Vermont before, but it's certainly even unique among all the states to see that, and you know,
especially all the chairs of the money committees are all women.
Yes,
and related.
The chairs in the House and the Senate of the Appropriations and the Ways and Means Committee are all women. Back when Gay Symington was Speaker of the House, I think Representative Carolyn Partridge was her majority leader at the time. So we have had women in leadership roles in the House. In fact, we are #1 in the country right now for the percentage of women in the legislature. But I would have to say that's the good news. The bad news is we all slid down in terms of numbers. So we still have more work to do. But I think having a woman at the podium really shows and serves, especially for younger women, that they can be up there. They can be the speaker. They can be the majority leader. They can be chair of appropriations. And so, actually, later on this month, we'll have Girls State and Boys State at the State House the same week that we are there for the veto session. So they might get a chance to watch us in action, which will be terrific.
Oh, that would be wonderful. I was always very involved in Girls State, Boys State. We'd go up and do mock. Committees with them and everything.
Well, and I would say even, we're going to talk here in a minute about the priorities that you had laid out at the beginning of the session. But what I noticed kind of watching is a lot of those priorities and a lot of those key players were women in leadership roles within both the House and Senate. As you mentioned, both the budget committees and money committees in both the House and the Senate had women leadership.
Yeah. And my counterpart in the Senate, the Senate Majority Leader is Senator Becca Ballant from Windham County as well.
I don't know her at all. She's fairly new. Huh?
She's fairly new and moved up through the ranks, so to speak, in the Senate very quickly. Very intelligent.
She's fantastic.
Woman. Yeah. And I think also, not to belabor the point too much, but there was definitely a different leadership style this year as opposed to the last several bienniums, I think, in the House. Kind of more relaxed and more collaborative, I guess, is what I would characterize it as. I don't know if you would characterize it differently.
Well, I think, with every new speaker and every leader, everyone has their own personality and leadership style. What I love about Speaker Johnson is that she is very collaborative, and she set a really strong tone in the beginning about working together across party lines, and I think that you saw that in a lot of the legislation that we passed this year in the House. And so it's been great getting to work with her, and I think that like we said, everyone in leadership roles were new this year, and so I think it was great to have a fresh start, but also, have people have the chance to get to know each other and learn how to work together in these new roles. So it was a really great experience.
Ben mentioned priorities, and when you were here February, you said that your priorities, I'm going to read them so I don't mess up. Strong, healthy Vermont, clean water, that's my favorite, affordable child care and housing, and minimum wage and economic growth. How did you do this year?
We did very well in those goals. Like I said, we really wanted to ensure that we're creating a strong future for Vermont, especially given what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now. In fact, I was just in Washington last week at a leadership conference, and we were hearing a lot of briefings about what's happening in D.C. with certain things around health care reform and with the budget. And it really hammered home for me the challenges that we are going to face shortly in Vermont. And so when I think about going back to clean water, we extended the funding for clean water in Vermont, and along with doing a really strong housing bill, which I think fits into economic development. One thing that we hear a lot about is about employees trying to lure different young professionals in from around the country to come to Vermont. And one of the biggest reasons people have trouble coming here is finding affordable housing. And it's not only for low-income Vermonters, but it's really for middle income as well. And so I think that it was a big piece of economic development this year. We also passed a really strong economic development bill that talked about apprenticeships, that had tax increment financing, TIF.
Right, that's right.
We extended the TIFs in there. Workforce development was folded into that. And pieces of that bill are actually tied to the budget. So I think we have some concerns around the governor's veto with the budget, and that a lot of those economic development pieces are actually linked to the budget as well. Another thing around economic development that I'm really excited about in economic growth is that our workforce right now doesn't have reliable, easy access to retirement. And one of the things that I've heard from businesses in my community is that as a small business, they have a hard time keeping up with some of the larger businesses in town in terms of benefits to offer. And
for retirement.
For retirement.
Right.
So we heard things like, not only retirement, but access to paid family insurance, paid family leave. Those policies could really help them create a level playing field when competing with these really large businesses. So I was really proud that we put in work for public retirement system for people to opt into to be able to do that. And so that's exciting.
That's great.
We mentioned childcare and housing. Again, those were things that we put in. The budget has more money for affordable childcare subsidies. So that's really important.
So back to the veto.
Sure.
Because I heard that there's a lot of really good things in the budget, and I must say I've just skimmed it.
Sure.
So if we veto it, you have to have a budget, and you have to have it or some kind of continuation, otherwise state government closes down June 30th.
June 30th is the deadline for
Yeah,
that.
so what's the plan?
Sure. Well, let me just first back up because I want to make sure everyone knows what is in our state budget. This budget passed with a near unanimous vote, which never, you served, Pat, when was the last time you remember a budget that had one person out of 180 people vote against it?
Right.
The budget has no new taxes, no new fees. You'll remember when we started off this legislative session, the governor said that he will not accept a budget that had raised taxes or fees, so we stayed within the box that he set, and knowing what we may have to deal with in Washington with cuts, right? So we move forward with that strategy with no new taxes and no new fees. And within that budget, we were still able to put in critical investments. So mental health treatment. We still have people who are stuck in emergency departments across the state because of mental health issues. That is unacceptable. So there's investments for mental health. The housing, the affordable housing bill that I talked about was folded into the budget. So that investment is in there. The child care subsidies, helping low-income people have access to child care, that is in the budget. Farm to school, working lands, a lot of our local economic development drivers are in the budget. So we were really proud of the work that we put into that. And I think at one point, even the governor said that if he was a House member, he'd vote for the budget. So that's why we are so incredibly disappointed that he decided to veto it. So what does that mean? So we have a veto session slated for the end of this month.
Right.
And what we will do is we will proceed, the procedure is that we would typically do is we would come and hold the vote on an override. We don't have, unless the Republicans get a signal from the governor, I believe, we don't have the votes to override the governor's veto. So we need 100 votes in the House. There's 150 members in the House, and the Democrats hold 83 seats. So that's not likely.
Right.
So we'll have the vote on the override, both for the budget and the yield bill, which was the other bill that he vetoed. And then we will go ahead and pass a pretty similar budget and yield bill and send it back to him to review. We are trying to meet with the governor to see if we can find a compromise.
So another bill will be brought forward to vote on?
We will not shut down the government over this.
That's a bad thing.
We are all in agreement that we do not want that to happen.
Right.
The consequences are just incredibly dire, and that's not where we're not going to do that. We are not Washington, D.C. So we will put forth a budget and a yield bill and send it back to the governor to sign. And like I was saying, we are trying to get him to meet with us and his administration to meet with us so we can sit around the table per Vermont tradition and see if we can hammer out a compromise. But again, the compromise has nothing to do with the budget. There is nothing in the budget that relates to some of the policies that he's talking about that he wants included. And so it's just incredibly frustrating to have him playing politics with the state budget that had, near unanimous support.
Right.
Well, it's an interesting situation because he's basically was put in a position to veto a budget that was exactly what he asked for, right, at the beginning of the session.
Yeah.
There was a fairly significant difference in the budget that he proposed in January and what actually passed the House, and that was a funding mechanism to move the teachers' health care and retirement funds from the general fund into the education fund, and basically his plan to finance that was to force school districts to level fund. That was pretty quickly thrown out by the legislature. There was tripartisan opposition to that proposal, and then the legislature came back with a very similar looking budget, but without shifting those two pieces. So it seems almost in a way that this healthcare proposal, which is very different from the original one that he proposed, was kind of something that he was putting forward as an alternative to that, and ended up sticking to that and asking it to be included in the budget. So when the legislature comes back next week, what do you expect the new budget to look like that you're sending back to the governor?
Well, since the budget really didn't have anything to do with what he's proposing, I would imagine that it would look very much the same to what we passed with that incredible amount of support. I think it's really hard to anticipate how this week will go. We are adamant on continuing to ask for meetings, to sit down, to talk this through, because we want to find a solution. But I think it's important that doing a big policy change in a veto session is not the Vermont way. That's not how Vermonters expect us to do our work. Ideas like this, where we change the way that it's not only school teachers, it's for all school
Sure,
staff,
it's administration, it's everybody.
negotiate their health care. It's a big change, and we really need to vet that to understand what are the consequences, what are the unintended consequences, how does this affect everyone who negotiates through that. It's a big change. He talks about property tax relief. We have property tax relief in the yield bill. So it's just really frustrating that we're offering these solutions and getting strong support for it, and yet still here for this veto session.
And I think the town clerks really need that tax bill passed as soon as possible, right? Because that's the formula for tax rates, and that would really set them back.
So if the governor vetoes another yield bill, we will have a $410 million hole in the education fund.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, and almost half the spending in the state is in the education fund.
Right.
And so that's a
And human services,
and
those are the
humans-
two big,
Right.
right.
and even comparing the two, education
Yeah,
is much
much bigger,
larger.
right.
So it's interesting to see a situation like this happen. And veto sections don't happen that often. And you have 2 days basically to try to figure this out. Has the administration come back to the table at all to try to work it out with you and the speaker?
Yeah, so the speaker and the pro tem have been communicating with the governor's office, asking for a meeting. There have been some phone calls and some memos back and forth. And I think at the end of the day, what the speaker and the pro tem are really asking for is not to have a memo war back and forth,
Right.
but to sit
Face to
down,
face, right.
face to face,
Right.
at the table. You know, I was just having a conversation with someone who was telling me the story again about when Governor Snelling was faced with a horrible budget crisis in Vermont, and it was a really hard situation. And he just walked out of his office, went right to the Speaker of the House, Ralph Wright's office, and said, "Let's figure this out."
Right.
They closed the door. They stuck it out. They hung out in there until they found a solution. They stuck out and walked out,
Right.
and they did it.
Right.
And that's what we need to do now.
Good.
Absolutely.
So I don't mean to, because we could do this for the whole show.
No, you do a whole show just on
But moving on.
Yeah.
You all are supporting the governor's stance on immigration. I'm assuming your caucus is supporting that.
We all of the caucuses had a co-sponsor on the legislation that we've been working on
Oh, good.
together
Okay.
that really addressed some of the concerns brought forth from the Trump administration's travel bans. And what the
Right.
legislation does is basically say that we can't create any type of registries in this state that would
Right,
be used for
right.
such a thing.
And
that's
we had the
important.
governor's attorney on here, and she was explaining the detail that they went through, the meetings, and just to make sure that they are in compliance with the law.
And that was passed really quickly,
Yeah.
just within a couple weeks, which is, for those familiar with the legislative process, that's
Right.
pretty quick
Yeah.
to
That's
turn
cool.
around that quickly.
Yeah, we worked really hard to get that passed. I got several calls from constituents on the first 2 days when that became public from the Trump administration, with people saying, am I going to have to be forced to
Right,
leave? I
right.
mean, I live in a very diverse community in the Old North End where we have a lot
Sure
of
you
new
do.
Americans and refugees, and the tension that was felt was just so heartbreaking. I live really close to one of our magnet schools in Burlington, IAA, and it's a very diverse school. And the kids were talking about it, and
Well, how
in
s- how scary for them, right?
elementary
Right.
school kids
Right.
were asking their parents if their friends were going to get sent away. I mean, it was really heartbreaking. So I think it was really important for us, and I think it was great that we were all able to work together, from the governor's office to the Senate to the House, to put forth a piece of legislation that would help reassure people that we are here to protect them.
Now, that's not up for discussion in June, is it?
No.
It's just the budget, the tax bill, and marijuana.
And the marijuana bill,
Right,
that's right,
which
the
I understand
legalization bill.
they're changing that as we speak, so that might get
You know,
the
so
governor's support.
it's fascinating. So this was a piece of legislation, a marijuana legalization, and the concept of having a tax and regulated system in Vermont. The Senate really wanted a tax and regulated system. The House felt that we really need to take an incremental approach and go to legalization instead.
Right.
The bill went back and forth through the House and the Senate several times, and we landed on what I thought was a really good, strong bill that would legalize marijuana in Vermont, not this year, but next year, and that had a commission attached to look at a tax and regulated system. We passed it at the end, and it went to the governor, and the governor felt that he didn't have enough time while we were in session to really review it and offer what his challenges were
Right,
with it.
right.
So unfortunately, it's too bad he wasn't at the table for that debate, because I think if we knew that, we probably would have been able to find a compromise so that he wouldn't have had to veto
Because
it.
it seems to me the things that he asked to be changed were not that dramatic. It was just expanding what's already in the bill, expanding fines, expanding. So I'm sure they're going to come up with some kind of compromise.
Yeah, so what we've done is we've had the leadership of the Judiciary Committees meet with members from Phil Scott's administration to talk through, through his veto message and what were the main points of contention. And so they've come together and have sent the governor actual language to review to see if that's something that we can find common ground on.
Great, good.
Yeah, and I think there's some members in the Senate that were even surprised that the governor was so willing to even move forward on this issue, having voiced opposition in the past.
Yeah.
And that he kind of opened the door, even though he vetoed the bill, he kind of opened the door to saying, well, here's a bill that I would sign, here's what it would look like.
Right, and I don't think any of them were outrageous demands. They were just a little tweaking of what's already there.
Yeah, so the question is, this will come back during the veto session because we have to address his veto. I know that there will be some type, at this point, all subject to change,
Right.
that we could have compromise language for both bodies to vote on. At this point, the House Minority Leader has said that he does not support that, and it would be up to his caucus, to the Republican caucus, if they would suspend the rules. So because we are working in a very short period of time, we have a procedure called suspending the rules,
Right.
which would say it is okay to fast track this.
Right.
And it's not clear. It looks like they don't have the support to suspend the rules. So I'm not sure if there will be any progress on that.
Back next year.
Which
But
means
back
it would
next year.
come back in January.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So one of the issues that I care a lot about, and I've worked for several years on, is the ethics bill, which finally passed this
It
year.
did.
It wasn't a perfect bill, but I think it moves the needle.
Yeah.
What was your reaction to the bill and your thoughts on it? And I know your caucus voted unanimously on it twice. So I'm kind of curious what leadership's take on it, and do they view it as a first step, and maybe where you feel the next steps might be?
Sure. So our goal with the ethics bill was creating more accountability and transparency, and we worked really closely with our caucus to find that balance. So I'm really proud that we were able to get that through with full caucus support both times. And so some of the highlights of the bill, it creates a ethics commission to review and keep track of complaints filed. It says that when you leave the legislature or someone in the administration, you can't lobby for a year in the building. And it creates more transparency for financial disclosure. So when you run for re-election or you run for election, you have to disclose income that you have over $5,000 for you and your spouse. And so this is a really good step forward. I would agree. I think that this is step one or step
Right.
two in the larger conversation of how we tackle ethics reform in our state. But I think this is a really good first step, and we'll learn a lot from it and then see where we go moving forward.
Because it's been many years you've
been
been trying to push that through. Right?
Several
Yeah,
years, and there's the House rule changes, which the House worked very quickly on that. Senate was a little bit behind them in adopting rules around ethics, and then finally we have a bill that applies to both the legislature and the executive branch.
Yeah.
One of the primary complaints of the bill that passed this year is the Ethics Commission, even though the bill creates one, is very weak. They don't have really the ability to investigate or even make a determination about potential violations. Is that something you think should be strengthened in the long term? And what's the balance between the legislature having control over its members and having this outside body that has some sort of oversight over the conduct piece of it?
Sure. So what we've had set up for many years, because I'm not sure everyone knows, is that in the House, and I believe in the Senate too, has its own ethics panel. And so when there is a complaint filed, it has members of all different parties that sit together and review it and make recommendations. They're also there as people to help give advice if there's an issue and someone's like, I don't know if this is a conflict of interest. They can check with the clerk and they check with the committee. So this has been the kind of practice for a long time in the House and in the Senate. And now what this ethics commission will do is sort of be the starting place and then funnel these complaints to the appropriate panel, whether it's in the House or the Senate or wherever. and then be able to better track the data of what happens with that. So I think what we need to do is learn from this and see what the scope of the complaints are, and I think eventually get to a more comprehensive system. I think this is just like anything we do. We need to take this in steps, learn, make sure we know that what's working, what's not working, and go from there. So I think that this is something we absolutely will need to revisit and see if we need to do more with that commission.
And I'm glad to hear you say that. I think that's one of the things I've tried to communicate to the legislature is, we're gonna need to come back to this in a year or two. And in fact, the funding mechanism that was put in place for it forces the legislature to come back in a year or two to reevaluate how the system is working.
I think wasn't it mostly including your spouse in the reporting? There was a couple of things that got people a little nervous. So if they can have some experience that it's not going to be so terrible, that maybe they'll feel good about it.
Right.
So we only have a couple minutes left, and since you mentioned Planned Parenthood early on,
Sure.
the federal government may be giving us less, and I think we've got about 47% of our budget federally funded. And
A third of our
you guys are coming back in October. And what are you most concerned about? Because I've heard Planned Parenthood talked a lot about in Washington.
Yeah, so there's a couple different things there. There's the budget that the Trump administration proposed and where that is in the process. So that is something that we are watching very, very closely, because that would have extreme consequences for Vermonters based on how it's currently introduced. Right now, the Congress a couple weeks ago passed a health care bill that is now in the Senate. That would have, again, serious cuts for health care, especially for Medicaid in our state.
Right.
There would be some serious caps put in place, and it would defund Planned Parenthood. And I think, we all know about the critical services Planned Parenthood provides across Vermont, and that is for a group of people their only source of health care. So right now, that's something that we're watching closely. As I learned last week in DC, that nothing is certain right now. So we are keeping in close contact with the federal delegation to have the latest understanding of what's happening, so that we can be prepared to respond.
Right.
And that's why we have time aside in October for us to meet if we need to. There's still a lot of tension and a lot of uncertainty, so it's possible that nothing happens, and then we address what might happen at the end of the year when they're forced to deal with something in January. So it's just really right now, it's communicating with the federal delegation about what, and they're very supportive too about our concerns. Having Governor Scott voice his concern to the administration about the serious effects that these cuts would have in Vermont, and we just got to keep that up and hope that we can delay or prevent anything from being cut that would really have a devastating effect on our state.
Ooh, you got a busy summer ahead of you. Jill, thank you very much for being on the show again. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you
Thanks
so much
for
for having
tuning
me.
in. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.